Great moments are born from great opportunity.
If you want to be loved as real champions, worthy champions, you're going to have to work and improve and change.
The inches we need are everywhere around us.
Hell yeah.
They're in every break of the game, every minute, every second.
Being perfect is about being able to look your friends in the eye and know that you didn't let them down because you told them the truth. And that truth is that you did everything that you could. There wasn't one more thing that you could have done. Can you live in that moment?
If you put your effort and concentration into playing to your potential, to be the best that you can be, I don't care what the scoreboard says at the end of the game, in my book, we're going to be winners.
This is your time.
The only ones who are going to tell me when I'm through doing my thing is you people here.
Hi once again, everybody. I'm Ed Berliner, and welcome into another edition of The Man in the Arena. There are moments that are captured in our sporting history when we are, whether we're fans, whether we're reporters, it makes no difference. When there always seems to be something else that's going to happen. We get a feeling that we're sitting on something that could be a powder keg, that could be historic, something that could change the lives of individuals, and maybe could just be fun, and maybe could be part of a sport that we will remember for so many years to come. In this instance, that goes back to 1986. It was opening day at Fenway Park in Boston, Massachusetts, and there was just a sense, for whatever reason, that something special was brewing.
Take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd.
Opening day at Fenway Park. Is there anything as optimistic as a Red Sox fan before the game? Who's going to win?
Who's going to win? The Red Sox.
Really?
Absolutely.
Come on, no.
Can't miss.
Come on, just between you and me.
Can't miss. They have an ordinary team this year, but I think they'll win today.
They got too much power, too much power.
Root for the home team. If they don't win, it's a shame.
It was a classic opening day, complete with sunshine, throngs of people, many of whom probably should have been somewhere else. And of course, these guys were out too.
So how much are these going for?
3 2 for 5.
3 2 for 5. You know the guy around the corner selling them for 4.
Fine.
How much are you selling these hats for now, the Sox hats?
Well, the professional caps were selling for $15, and the regular mesh caps are $6.
Does that price go down depending on how the season goes?
No. It's stable. For the rest of the year, it'll be like that. Whether they win or lose, doesn't matter.
No mercy, no mercy.
No mercy at all.
Now, there's a couple of things to consider in that little introduction right there from WGBH. First of all, I dare you right now to go out and try and find 2 pair of sunglasses for $5. And I also double dog dare you to go out and try and find a professional baseball cap for $15. Not only that, but if you're a guy selling these caps, what are you doing wearing a Mets jacket in Boston? I mean, the guy survived, for crying out loud. That's it. I have no idea who he is, but he must have gotten out of there alive. That in itself was a man with a tremendous amount of guts. But it was guts and glory and a team that wasn't supposed to go anywhere. There were the 1986 Boston Red Sox, and no one could have possibly imagined how they would go down in baseball history, certainly in Red Sox lore, and what would happen in the Fall Classic that year. That is part of the memory, and that is part of the memory that is brought to you in a brand new book that is called Two Sides of Glory. And believe me, if you are someone who knows all about the Red Sox in '86, you know that there were 2 sides to that glory. And the author joins us here today. He is a author of 7 books on baseball. 2 are New York Times bestsellers about the lasting brotherhood of the '69 Mets. Mookie Wilson in the '86 Mets. That's got to be fun in and of itself. My goodness, his writings and his documentary work has been on ESPN, Comcast, Root Sports. He has spoken at the Baseball Hall of Fame, the Yogi Berra Museum in Montclair, New Jersey. Even better, he's a Boston guy because he went to Emerson College in Boston. So that in itself sets the stage. And the latest book, of course, Two Sides to Glory. It's a pleasure to welcome Erik Sherman to The Man in the Arena. Hello, Erik.
Hi, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here. What an intro.
Well, we work for the good stuff here. We don't try and just leave it. Hi, here's Erik. Let's talk baseball. Sorry, it's a little bit better than sports talk goes these days. We try to do that. Now, before we get started, you were there. I mean, you lived in Boston during those years. So let's start right there. As somebody who was part of it and was there to watch it, what was it like just the beginning of that season? Because I know, talking to people, that there was something special about that season. People felt it for whatever reason.
They started to feel it on a chilly, rainy night in April when Roger Clemens struck out the 20 Seattle Mariners. That's when they started to feel it. That changed everything. They felt like they had a guy that would go out and win every fourth game, and they had an ace, the best pitcher in baseball. And that was very different from what they were used to. They were always a hitting team, and now they had the dominant pitcher in all of baseball. So that was the difference, I think, along with some great key additions like Donnie Baylor, and then later on in the season when they picked up Tom Seaver and Dave Henderson and Spike Owen, it really made the fans believe that they were going to go for it.
Is it not fair to say also that as 86 started and went on its merry way, that you had a fan base that was living, eating, sleeping, breathing, dying on every single second, every pitch, every moment? Because let's face it, we're still talking in 86 about 1917, and we're still talking about the curse that was there. So I've got to imagine that people were looking for anything they could to find a latch onto at that point and hope that the Red Sox could win a pennant.
Well, no question about it. The curse of the Bambino, they hadn't won since 1918. It was 68 years. They had gone 7 games in 3 World Series and lost them all before 86. So they were ready. And another point to what you were saying, they were must-see TV. It was before the days of all the video games and cable TV was in its infancy. Everybody watched baseball back then. So that really put a spotlight on that particular 86 team. Like I said, once Roger Clemens struck out the 20, it made believers out of that city.
Now, I lived in Boston for 4 years, but I was there during 03 and 07. So I'm the guy that constantly tells people, look, until I got there, you had no chance of winning the World Series. So I got here, I'm taking full credit for winning this thing because I happened to be here in 04 and I was the missing link. So I want to get that right out of the way. I take full credit. I'm not a doctor, I just play one on TV. But this is all part of this enduring love affair of the Red Sox. Before we even get to the glory, it is, I've lived in so many places and watched so many teams. And of course the Yankees fans love their team. They live, eat, sleep, and breathe with it. Mets fans are like that. Dodgers fans are certainly like that. But what's at the core, in your opinion, of that love affair with the Red Sox?
Well, first of all, they're the only team in New England. They cover 5 states, really. And everybody feels better after the Red Sox win up there. And even if they, aren't watching every game on TV, they follow them. And between the Boston Globe, you have 12 or 13 writers covering the team during the season, and there's nobody else. There's no other team that competes against them pretty much from May until October in New England. Of course, they have, great teams with the Celtics and the Bruins and the Patriots. My God, how can we leave them for last? But
wait a minute. It's funny. Back then, if you think about it, the Patriots were last.
They were. Although they went to the Super Bowl against the Bears in January of '86. So that was quite a time to be in Boston.
The book itself, and let's go ahead and get to it, because I mentioned the title, and that was A Season of Glory. When you started to put together the book and write about it, what was the focus on that two sides of glory?
Well, there's never been a team in the history of baseball that has endured the highest of highs and the lowest of lows within a 2-week period in any October. They were down to their final strike against the California Angels in a Game 5 of a best-of-7 series. I mean, the odds of the Red Sox coming back and winning that game against the Angels, down 2 runs, down to their last strike, first against Mike Witt, who was just stealing in that game 5 for the Angels, then for them to take the lead on the miraculously timed home run by Dave Henderson after Donnie Baylor had homered earlier in the inning, when Dave Henderson just looked overmatched. And he reached out 2 strikes and just, golfed a ball over the left center field fence. Then the Angels, they come back and they tie it in the bottom of the 9th, almost win the game then. And then the Red Sox win the game on a sacrifice fly by Henderson in extra innings. They go back to Boston, and the Red Sox just steamrolled over the Angels in those two games. So imagine, they're 1 strike away from elimination. Then they come back, they win 2 more in Boston. Then they win the first 2 games of the World Series. So, I mean, they're on quite a roll. The highest of highs, certainly one side of glory. And then, less than a week and a half after Game 2 of the series, they're 1 strike away from ending the curse of the Bambino. And 68 years of near misses and just catastrophic endings. And 1 strike away, and they can't get it done. And then they can't get it done the next 2 nights later in Game 7 when they had a 3-0 lead and their hottest pitcher on the mound. So it truly was 2 sides of glory, and I wanted to fly around the country and meet with the key and most intriguing players and see how those 2 weeks affected not just the rest of their careers, but the rest of their lives as well. And it was just compelling interviews, highly emotional in a lot of cases, to hear them 30 plus years later talking about it.
When you talk about emotional and all these players that you talk to, which one came up in your memory as the most emotional interview?
I would have to say the one with Bruce Hurst. And it's interesting. He was one of the last interviews that I did. He lives in Arizona, and a teammate of his said, "Have you talked to Bruce yet?" And I'm like, "No, he doesn't want to be interviewed for this book." And he goes to me, "Oh, that's crazy. Bruce Hursty, are you kidding?" Well, it turned out that, Bruce hadn't done an interview about 86 in 4 years. He was done with it. It still deeply affected him, and he just didn't want to do it anymore. Well, anyway, I called him personally after getting the number from the teammate, and he thought I was somebody else, a friend of his. So the greeting when he saw the number was very favorable. And I'm like, "Oh, wow, okay, well, this is different than I thought it would go. He's happy to hear from me." Well, as it turned out, he said, "Oh, okay, well, look, Erik, I'm really sorry, but I'm done with talking about 86. So after about 25 minutes, he finally acquiesced after I told him, "You're really the last guy that I need to talk to." And he goes to me, "Well, all right, I don't want to be that guy." So I said, "Look, I'll keep it relatively brief, 45 minutes. And he says, "Look, Erik, Bruce is such a great guy." He goes, "If you fly all the way out to Phoenix to see me, I'll give you as long as you want." Well, he broke down a few times. He was highly emotional. And honestly, when I do these books, it's not uncommon for these guys to get emotional. When I did Kings of Queens, Life Beyond Baseball with the 86 Mets, Dwight Gooden got emotional. Darryl Strawberry got emotional. A couple of the other guys on that team did with this Red Sox book. Certainly Rich Gedman was another one. Wade Boggs, because they care. They really care about their impact on not just baseball in the '86 season, but the fans and just their love of the game. And but out of all of them, Bruce was the most emotional, and we had to stop the interview a couple of times, and just so he could compose himself a little bit. But it's not uncommon. These guys, they really seem to open up to me. I don't know if it's because they seem to think I know what I'm talking about, or I have empathy, or I'm a good listener. I don't know what it is, but that's what makes these interviews really compelling, because not only is the reader listening to what they say, but also they get the sense of how they're saying it. And that adds so much, which is why I love to do in-person interviews.
Do you get a sense that maybe some of that emotion comes from some of the things we've talked about, that there was pressure on these teams every year in order to win? It was that curse of the Bambino, because, man, when I got there in '03, look, that's years later, it was being pounded into the skulls of the players. Even then, it was on every set of lips. Of course, talk radio had taken off at that point, and social media in its infancy. But in '86, I've got to imagine that even then, people were reminding the players, hey, come on, you guys. It's been 1917. My grandmother hasn't seen a victory. She's going to die real soon, and you're not going to win her a World Series. I got to believe that in itself took an emotional toll on every single one of these players. It had to.
They were aware of it, but it was a creation more of the writers. The Boston media, especially back then in the '80s, was brutal on their teams, particularly the Red Sox, because the players swear that it was better copy when they lost than when they won.
They're right. I know the writers from then. I've spoken to them. That's exactly what it was.
There was a writer. His last name was Fitzgerald. Do you remember him?
No, I don't.
He wrote an article. I'll never forget the article. I think his name was Joe Fitzgerald. He wrote an article for, I think it was the Globe, in which he actually criticized Larry Bird for scoring 50 points one night. And his reasoning was, well, that's not Celtics basketball. Now, the Celtics won the game, and Bird scored 50, but yet he writes a column criticizing Larry Bird because it wasn't Celtics basketball where everyone contributed relatively evenly. But that was all about the Red Sox too. They had one of the great players in history in Jim Rice. I think the most fearsome hitter over a 3 or 4 year period. And really, the media wasn't very kind to him, and I think as a result, he had issues with the media too. In fact, it was combative a couple of times, and yet from everything I've heard about Rice, he was great with kids. He, played practical jokes and kept things light in the clubhouse. But there was this distrust of the media, and I think especially in the '80s, it was the same way in New York too. But Boston was really pretty brutal back then, and so I think they played it up more than the players did in terms of the curse of the Bambino. But they were constantly reminded. The '77 team had a big lead. The '78 team, my God, they had a 14 game lead in July. But ultimately, the team would always falter in August and September. But I think the difference with the '86 team, and he only went 5-7, but when they went out and they got Seaver, the electricity in the ballpark that first night that he pitched, it was standing room only, and it was it was at the start of every newscast. That told the players, we're going for we're bringing in this veteran. And as it turned out, like I said, he was 5-7, ERA of around 4. He was fine, a serviceable fourth
but
starter.
he's Tom Seaver. That's just
right.
it.
And the impact, it was his last season of his career as it turned out, but the impact he had on Bruce Hurst and on Roger Clemens, who, they put his locker next to Clemens, Joe Sambito, who grew up rooting for the Mets on Long Island. The impact Seaver had on that clubhouse and in the dugout and as a mentor to these guys was immeasurable. And then what really put them over the top, they just made an incredibly fortuitous trade with the Mariners in August to bring in Dave Henderson and Spike Owen. Tony Armas, their regular center fielder, was often injured. They had dealt Steve Lyons in the Seaver trade, so they didn't really have anybody. Then they go out and get Dave Henderson, and he would have been, one of the great World Series heroes of all time had they won. Plus what he did in the ALCS.
Sure.
And Spike Owen hit over 400 in the postseason. So that was a remarkable trade. But the Red Sox were going for it, and they would not be denied that season. And I think that when Red Sox fans really look back at that, it was a different kind of season than 78 and 77 and to a degree, even 67.
When you had a chance to talk to all the players, and again, my living in Boston for a short time much later, and you lived during that era there, let's be very honest as we talk about Boston and sports, and the people who live there will have to agree with this. 1986 was a very difficult racial time in America. It was a very difficult racial time in Boston because as I speak to players who played in the 70s and the 80s, Black players will tell me many times how it was very difficult and they did not feel as if they were consistently being accepted despite the fact they played for the old town team. And that is another hammer which dropped on these players. So as you talked to a lot of these guys, did you get a sense, was there any discussion factor about that being part of the weight that they carried?
Well, Bruce Hurst talked about it, and once I got him talking, it turned out to be one of the great chapters. So your viewers should know. So this book, what I basically did was, each chapter is a literary portrait of the player that I interviewed. So the chapter I did with Bruce Hurst, he talked the most about what Jim Rice went through. Particularly when he came up. Now, he came up in really his first full season was 1975, and that was the year that Boston had the busing, where they would bus African-American kids into predominantly Irish and Italian neighborhoods. So there was a lot of strife really in Rice's first full season with the club. It's something that Jim Rice didn't really talk much about, but I'll tell you who did talk a lot about, Oil Can Boyd. But he talked about it more in terms of how the African-American athlete and youngster doesn't play baseball as much today. Oil Can loved the Boston fans in general. Were there the occasional racist remarks coming from the stands? Yes. And it was certainly something that Boston had to deal with. It was a part of their history. This is a club, if you go even further back, Ed, you can talk about the fact that Jackie Robinson, could have been a Boston Red Sox. Willie Mays could have been a Boston Red Sox. They were tried out by the Red Sox, but ultimately not signed. The Red Sox were the last team to have an African-American, Pumpsy Green, I believe it was. So the history there, how much did it weigh on the 86 team? It's tough to say, but I'll tell you, I think it really helped that they traded for players and they brought in players like Donnie Baylor and Dave Henderson. to go along with the Jim Rice and an oil can Boyd. And I think it made it easier on Rice and Boyd. I think Baylor had a tremendous impact. Easy to forget, he also drove in over 100 runs that season.
Well, there's so many stories that we're getting into here. We're going to be looking at a 3-day interview by the time this is done. So Hurst came out and was so emotional then. And as you traveled around to all of these different players and you spoke to, who was the most surprising? I mean, Hurst, of course, was surprising that he spoke, and you weren't aware of that. But when you started to speak to the players, and you and I both know that as interviewers, when you get going, occasionally it'll take a left, it'll take a right, it'll take a second left, and all of a sudden you're into great stories that you never expected someone to actually tell you. Who was that?
Oh boy, each of these chapters, they're like children. I mean, they're great in different ways, but I would say the biggest surprise was Oil Can Boyd, and I'll tell you why. The Dwight Evans, I was going to say Dwight Evans, I was going to say Rich Gedman, just for how emotional they got. And Dwight Evans' story, playing his career with two boys who had elephant man's disease, which is what it's commonly known as. That's a book in itself. But Oil Can Boyd he surprised me. To answer your question, which player surprised me the most? He is so intelligent on American history and the plight of the African American. And it felt like to me I was interviewing two people. There was the Oil Can Boyd who, is not afraid to say, he smokes marijuana almost every day and played and pitched after smoking marijuana, to give him focus. And
that's the can right there.
That's the can. And there's a little bit of Bill Lee in him, but just like the street smart guy. He kind of talks like a little bit of jive, and but then there's the other Oil Can who you could completely picture behind a podium talking to a college classroom like a professor, almost eloquent. So that surprised me because he would go back and forth depending on the topic. And sometimes in midstream, in mid-conversation, he would flip from one personality to another. And so that surprised me the most.
I'm laughing because I got to meet the Can, and
yes,
I know exactly what you're talking about. It's like I'm replaying the interview in my head right now, and I'm seeing it. It's like the Can is here, then the Can is here, then it's over here, then he's over here, and he's just it's fun interviewing a guy like that because you got to keep up, with where he's going.
You really can, and one of the things that I try to do, with this book, Two Sides of Glory, and with Kings of Queens, I wrote them in the new journalism way. So I'm a part of the story in that the reader knows what I'm thinking at times. I'm there, I'm taking in the atmosphere. And Oil Can, for my Red Sox book, was Lenny Dykstra of my Mets book. So they both kind of, you come with your questions, with your prepared questions, but they kind of take over the interview. And that's perfectly okay, because for the types of books that these are, it's more entertaining that way. Let them take it over. My God, Lenny Dykstra was breaking out his laptop and showing me videos of when he was with the Phillies and had the big series in the playoffs, and then he's getting on the phone with Charlie Sheen, and so Oil Can didn't take over the interview quite that much, or it was more than an interview with Lenny. It was an experience. But
I was going to say, Lenny is not like just sitting back waiting for an experience. With Lenny, Lenny's one of those people, you ask him a question and let him wander. Just let him go and come back in 30 minutes. Come back in 30 minutes. You have no idea where you're going to be.
No. So Oil Can, he was all over, but he just really surprised me with how astute he was on American history. Like I said, it was like interviewing two different people, and he was a joy to interview. And at the end, he said, "You know what? You're a friend. You call me Can. My friends call me Can." So it was nice.
Yeah, that's when you get close to them, it's fun. That when you get that kind of relationship with the players, and I had that with some of them that I covered during that 03, 04, 05 season. Manny Ramirez and I still to this day have an interesting relationship where I just let him go one day on camera, and it was one of the most frighteningly hysterical things I've ever experienced in my career. And there's always Manny looking at me going, "You could probably pull off the cornrows, dude. You could try that." At that point, you have them. It's perfect. Now, so let's kind of set the stage here for the next time, because you alluded to a lot of this, and I want to get there to that World Series. But not just the World Series. Look, we've all heard the call. Everybody's heard Vin Scully's call. Everybody's seen Gary Carter going crazy. Everybody's seen all this before. But what many people haven't seen to this day, even though it's available, is when you look at how the Red Sox were greeted by the people of Boston at City Hall when the World Series was over. This is from WCVB in Boston, and it's just a very short clip of the mayor at the time and the manner with which you can feel and see how this is a team that just lost a complete heartbreaking series that they should have won. There's no doubt the Red Sox should have come home with the World Series. And how they were greeted by the fan base at that time, to me, is still one of the great moments in fan history.
Ladies and gentlemen, a team we are very, very proud of. A team that experts predicted would finish no better than third or fourth in this season. A team, a city that could not love its baseball team any more than the city of Boston. From Oil Can Boyd to John McNamara to Roger Clemens. This is the sports capital of the city of Boston. Boston, American League champions, the Boston Red Sox. We love them. Let's hear it for them. Roger, good job.
I mean, you just don't see that anymore in sports. It doesn't happen because it was a different era, different time. As I said, we weren't overburdened with sports talk radio and cable television and 7,000 internet channels that would throw everybody's up, and then Twitter feeds and everybody's own YouTube. That was a classic moment that everybody got to experience together. As you talked to the players, what did you sense was coming from them when they came home? Their thoughts about how people treated them when they came back, because I have got to believe that there were a number of players who felt that they'd never be able to show their face in Boston again.
Well, there were
one in particular, which we'll talk about momentarily, but for the large part, I got to believe that a lot of them felt that they'd never be forgiven.
Right, and as you saw from that video clip, it didn't really hit the fan base right away. After talking with Bill Buckner, I did the last major interview of Bill Buckner's life, and he said that he didn't really feel it, the scorn, until the following spring when he went to spring training. And spring training, there's nothing really to report on. So the writers, they were trying to stir things up a little bit, sell newspapers. And that's when the questions started to really come about the Game 6 era by Buckner, and about was it a pass ball or a wild pitch? Did Gedman get crossed up, or was it Stanley's fault? Everything that went wrong in Game 6 especially came up again, and that's when I think the players started feeling it much more than in that clip that you just showed. But yes, there were some things that started cropping up. Somebody drove to Bob Stanley's house, and his kids were playing outside, and this guy pulled over and knocked one of his kids' bikes down, and then drove off. Bill Buckner, on several occasions, some kid asked him for an autograph on his baseball, and some 18-year-old kid said, you better hand it to him or else he'll drop it, that type of thing. Then, there was an instant when he was in his car, and somebody made a snide remark after recognizing him, and Buckner literally chased his car down the street. So there were those isolated instances, but Buckner even told me, even though the scar remained until the day that he died, 90-something% of the letters that he received were letters of encouragement, because he just dealt with what he had to endure after that error so well in public. I mean, he was a stand-up guy. This was a guy that had 2,715 career hits, won a batting title, had a higher fielding percentage than Lou Gehrig. And to the casual fan, what they remember most is that error that he made in Game 6, which didn't cost them the game. I mean, the game was already tied. And if he fields it, he probably doesn't beat Mookie to first. Stanley wasn't going to get there in time. And so you have had runners on first and third of a tie with a tie game, and who knows what happens then.
Well, and there's something else, just as what you're saying here, and this is always something that gets overlooked here. Billy Buckner had lousy knees at that point, and you could see it. The fact that Buckner was at first base that late in the game is still a defensive mistake that has to be looked at from the dugout, because you've got a chance to win the game. What do? Your basic thinking process is you put your best fielders in the game at that time. So Buckner was in many ways, and I'm not trying to make excuses, I'm just giving the reality here. He was given a near impossible task in many ways that I'm sure his ego said, yeah, I can play it. Don't worry about it, Skip. I can get out there and I can do it. But at that point, you have to make the decision and you say, no, Bill, we're bringing you in at this point. To me, that's something that still gets missed in the entire argument.
Well, a lot of things were happening right around that moment. First of all, Dave Stapleton was Buckner's defensive replacement in late inning games through most of the second half of the season when the Red Sox had a lead during the ALCS. But Buckner McNamara was very close with the veterans. He was a veterans kind of manager at that stage of his life. And he asked Buckner, he says, do you feel like going out there? And Buckner said, sure. Now, Buckner believed that even with a bad Achilles, and you're right, he was hobbling out there. He was just crippled with these injuries. He should not have been out there with 3 outs to go, but he wanted to be one of the heroes on the field, one of the conquering heroes. And McNamara basically let him do it. And if Stapleton's out there, maybe he fields the ball cleanly, and it's a tie game.
Right, but you're still bringing up the fact that there could have been runners at first and third at that point, because Stanley never would have beaten Mookie to first base in the first place. You could see that from watching the tape.
Right. And something else said that this book reveals really for the first time, and it comes from Marty Barrett, one of the most astute ball players anywhere. So they had a pickoff play on. So Ray Knight advanced to second on the wild pitch. So the game is tied. Ray Knight is going crazy at second base. He's out of his wits. He's so excited that the Mets have just tied the game, which was a miracle in itself. So Ray Knight, if you go back and you look at the video, is about 40 feet off second base. So Barrett notices this, calls for a pickoff. He calls it into Gedman behind the plate. Now, whether, Stanley was just wanted to concentrate on the hitter or missed the sign, he didn't really remember. But they had this play on. So Barrett had to shade closer to second. Buckner then had to shade even had to shade even further towards second to cover some of Marty Barrett's real estate around the second base position. And Mookie, who never pulled the ball like that, hits a little dribbler up the first baseline. So now Buckner's got to go to his left, like 3 or 4 extra steps to get in position to field that ball. And I think that had a huge effect. And that, of course, never really gets talked about. But if Buckner could have set himself and had that extra second or so, I think it would have made a big difference.
I think we also need to point out, too, that, again, there was another game.
Yeah.
And I'm not afraid of saying this because I've gotten into arguments before over this in Boston when I said it out loud on my show, and I got hammered for it by certain people. I said, without a doubt in my mind, the press in this town, the sports press in this town in Boston, kept alive the Bill Buckner issue. You drilled on it. You destroyed the guy's life because of what he did. And you completely forgot that there was a Game 7 that, again, the Red Sox had a chance to come back and win, and they didn't. And, Erik, I got to tell you, I had one guy at a bar one night. I was like 3 days after I'd said that on the air. We did a show called Sports Pulse on CN8 in Boston. He came up to me and said, I ought to knock the crap out of you. I'm sick and tired of hearing it. What are you blaming us for? Because we weren't the one who did it. We didn't create the error. He said, I ought to knock the spit out of it. And it almost came down to blows. He was so offended by the fact that I had blamed the media, the press, for what they did. And I looked at him. I said, you can hit me all you want. First of all, you hit me. I'm going to beat the daylights out of you, and I'm going to put you in the hospital. The next thing is the error is still going to be there, and the mistake that you guys still pulled in 1986 is still there. You still cost the guy his life, for crying out loud. So I'm just going off on a tangent here, but that's part of 86 is the fact that I got to believe even the players that you talked to wanted to say, look, we know we had another game to win this. Stuff happens in baseball. We didn't get the job done. This is not all on Billy Buck.
Oh, of course. There were so many things that went wrong. One of they're all really great interviews, but the one I had with Clemens went 7 hours, and
wow.
He was ready to go in Game 7. He's like, I was waiting for Mac to have me come in, and Clemens was also taken out of Game 6. He developed a blister after 7 innings, and he didn't ask out of the game. That's another thing the book reveals. Now, for years, it's been he said. What did McNamara say? What did Clemens say? Well, Marty Barrett reveals in this book that he was standing right next to Clemens, and Clemens did not ask out of the game. It was McNamara's call. And whether or not McNamara felt that 2 nights later, Clemens with the blister, shouldn't come into pitch, or if he didn't want to overuse him. I mean, he was the crown jewel of the pitching staff, a great young pitcher. Maybe he didn't want to risk injury. But my goodness, I mean, you've got from October until April to rest up. Clemens was raring to go. And, this happens all the time now. In these final games of World Series, who can forget Bumgarner a few years ago, coming in and I think he pitched 5 shutout innings in the decisive game for the Giants. Going back further, what Pedro Martinez, did against Cleveland in that ALCS 20 years ago, coming out of the bullpen, I think in the 4th inning or something like that, and not giving up a hit, if memory serves me correctly. I mean, this is what your aces do. So I think McNamara had a much worse series than Buckner and Stanley and a few of the other guys.
No one talks about it. No one talks about it to this day.
No, nobody talks. McNamara got a pass, and I don't understand why. One of the things that Buckner said to me was, he was relieved. I met with him in the month of October, and he goes, geez, Erik, this is the first October I can remember where I'm not seeing my error replayed by Fox or who's ever showing the game, in the postseason. It was just on a reel every October, the ball going through his legs. And so the media decided that Buckner was going to be the GOAT. And it was just incredibly unfair. And I mean, the one thing, he befriended Mookie Wilson, and they became great friends and business partners. And Buckner was able to put all three of his kids through college with the money that he made, signing the photo of Mookie running up the first baseline as the ball went through Buckner's legs. So at least he got something out of it, hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Good for him.
And he said, and he said that generally the people that asked him to sign, he remembered one incident where someone made some snide comment, but that was it. So good for Buck.
Good, absolutely good for him. When you mentioned that he hadn't seen the play over and over again, thankfully, finally, it reached a point where it's over. But when the 30th anniversary of the 86 game came up, there was a celebration at Fenway Park. Now, of course, things have changed. The Red Sox are perennial contenders. They have put several World Series behind them at this point. So the question then arises for the current generation. Why is it important to remember a team that more than 30 years ago didn't win the World Series?
I could not have written this book 15 years ago. I definitely could not have written this book 26 or 27 years ago because I tried. Marty Barrett and I were going to collaborate on a book on the 86 season back in, when was that? 1994, something like that, 1993. So it was 7 or 8 years after 86. And my agent at the time pitched it to every major publisher, 20-something publishers. And everyone was like, it's just too soon. Despite what a magical season it was other than Game 6 and 7. And even with Game 6 and 7, it's a place in history, in the annals of the history of baseball. This was a very important team. And so anyway, I think they're celebrated by the Boston fans after 30 years or 35 years, much for the same reason I was able to do the book now, because the fans look back at that team nostalgically. It was a star-crossed team. They were on a magic carpet ride throughout that season. It was a foregone era, very different times. Much like in the way you and I probably, when we were kids, look back at the 1950s. But I can tell you, Joe Castiglione wrote the foreword for this book. He's the Hall of Fame broadcaster of the Red Sox since 1982. He told me that whenever one of those Red Sox players from the 86 team is at Fenway Park, he has them up in the booth, and they're like conquering heroes, returning home. So they all look back at their time in Boston very favorably, and the fans look at them in a very favorable light too. And but for the fans, I think it helped, honestly, quite a bit after they finally slayed the dragon and won the series in 2004 and then 2007, and then they won 2 more times, and it just got easier, I think.
Well, I think also that 1986 season sort of personifies the adversity of Red Sox baseball and the city of Boston and baseball there. I think it taught a lot of lessons, and I think it still resonated. And if you go back and look what Lou Gorman did and the way he brought hope to a franchise that did not have any consistent hope for so long, it's difficult to say, but it helped to set a foundation that, well, yeah, okay, you're going to say, hey, Ed, wait a minute, it took 18 years for anything to happen. Have you been in baseball lately? Sometimes it takes time. Back then. It's not as easy then as it is now. So it's sort of, I think it gave fans in Boston something to say, we're that close, we can be that close again. And maybe it gave them just a little hope. I don't know, maybe I'm extrapolating, but I'm sure there are a lot of people who still say, my grandfather still died without a World Series and I hate you guys.
But, to your point, it's not easy. And now with the extended playoffs, it's even more difficult to get through it all. But let's just talk about the 86 Mets for a second. This was a team that won 108 games. They won that thrilling series against the Astros, and then they won the World Series. And, everybody thought, my goodness, Dwight Gooden's 21 years old. Darryl Strawberry was 23 or 24. People were thinking, this team, this is just the beginning of a dynasty. I mean, look at the, at the core of this team. I mean, they're going to be great for years to come. Well, here we are 35 years later, and they haven't won again. They've gone 35 years without a World Series championship. And, I mean, that's incredible. I mean, if you had said to somebody after the 86 season, you know what, it's going to be 2021, and the Mets will still be looking for their third World Championship of their history, people would have been like, you're nuts. They're going to win 3 or 4 more with these guys. It's hard.
And people don't realize it. They just go, it's got to be easy. You've got the money. You can go out and buy a team. And you certainly couldn't go out and buy a team back then because you still had to sort through what were the flotsam and jetsam, if you will, in some areas. Look, Spike Owen was a key player in certain times, but he wasn't anybody anyone's going to remember as being a key, but he was part of a piece that led that team to be able to win the World Series. So is it not also fair to say that in putting together a book like this and spending the time and interviewing all of these ball players, that you really get a sense of the generational difference? And you mentioned this earlier, and I wrote it down. They care, their impact, and they did. The 86 team did care, and you've proven that with all of your interviews. And as we do this interview here in 2021, there seem to be fewer players who care about their impact. They're still there, of course. It's not all as if they're all full of hubris and ego. But it does, if you read the book and read the interviews, you go back to a time when maybe we could use a little more. Maybe we could use a little more of players who actually care about their impact and care about what they say to fans and to kids and how it reacts. And so it's not a bad generational learning experience.
No, it's not. It's not. It was a very different game then. And I think it was, on many levels, it was a better game, period. The games, they moved along. It wasn't like, sounding like, the old guy telling the kids to get off the lawn.
Here we are. Somebody's going to say, oh, come on, Berliner and Sherman, will you please get off the lawn, for crying out loud?
I know.
But it's true.
It is. I mean, it's a strikeout or a home run most of the time. And, you take a guy like Marty Barrett. This was a guy that typically hit after Boggs and before Jim Rice or before Bill Buckner. So he was one of those guys that was a situational hitter. So Boggs was getting on first base half the time. He was like a 5 or 6 time batting champion. And, so it was Barrett's job to move him up. And so he was consistently, hitting balls to the right side, to move Boggs to third after a double, and to set up Rice or Buckner, to get on base for the big guys. Now you have so many second basemen that are hitting, 15, 20, 25 home runs, but they're also striking out 120, 130 times a year. So it's a very different game. And I think it was a better game then, yes. But they cared. And the thing that resonates with me after the Red Sox lost the 7th game was seeing one of the greatest players of all time bawling his eyes out on the Red Sox bench. Wade Boggs. I mean, he lost his mother that July, which in a car accident, which was devastating. So he was certainly thinking of that at that moment, and we talked about that in the book. But he was also, of course, thinking about how close they had come, and the players, you know, they loved Mrs. Yawkey, who was the owner at the time, the widow of Tom Yawkey, and they loved Jean Yawkey, and they wanted to win it so badly for her and for the fans, and to come that close. And that vision that I have of Wade Boggs bawling his eyes out on the Red Sox bench, that tells you all you need to know. Do these guys care? They did deeply, and they still do today.
The book gives everybody an opportunity to look a little bit deeper, not just into the Boston Red Sox of 1986, but also, as we have just discussed here, Major League Baseball in 1986 and the athlete in 86, and the way that they looked at fans and their responsibility, if you will. And as you've heard Erik detail here, there's some stories involved in here that you've never heard before, which is why I got to dig deeper into this now, because I love these kind of books. I just, anytime I can get to read stories about players that are first-time shots, I'm all over it. So let's remind everybody, the book came out in March of 2021. It is called Two Sides of Glory. It is available everywhere. Run out, get a copy, read it. It's baseball, but it's sports, and it's fun is what it is. That's the biggest part of it. I want to remind everybody, too, that on social media, you can reach Erik on Facebook at Erik Sherman Baseball and at Erik Sherman. For those of you listening on our audio podcast, that is ERIK, Erik Sherman. Make sure you get that right now. Come on, we're going to make sure of these points here. On Twitter, it's by Erik Sherman, BY Erik Sherman. Instagram, it is Erik Sherman 9. What, there were 8 other Erik Shermans? Come on, you got to get that name from them, will you please?
There's another author who's Erik Sherman that spells his name with a K, and he's a journalist, and he's written books. It's crazy.
So there you go. You got to pick 9. You got to put. Is there Ted Williams' number? 9?
Yes. I also grew up in the New York area, and I played third base in Little League, high school, and college. So I watched Greg Nettles all the time.
Okay.
So that's where I got the 9 from.
Fine, Nettles or Williams, and either one is fine by me. You're nailing great players there. Also, the blog is at erikshermanbaseball.com, where you can find out a whole lot more and stay in touch. And there's a raft of books that Erik has written on Major League Baseball, and I heartily recommend you go out and get them. Erik, thank you so much. It has been an absolute thrill. I'll tell you, I love telling stories. I love hearing stories about players and the past. And this book in itself is just encapsulating an era that I think so perfectly needs to be told again. So great success with the book. Sell 1 million copies and come back for your next one. Will you please?
Oh, absolutely. This has been so much fun and a pleasure. And thanks so much for having me on.
Always a pleasure. Thanks so much. Erik Sherman, don't forget, run out and get a copy of that book, because it is one that you need to get. Oh, yeah, by the way, let me just make sure. I want to do it one more time. Two Sides of Glory. Make sure you pick it up, because it is available everywhere. Don't forget, you can reach me on social media, reach us and watch the shows all the time at welcometothearena.com. My thanks to Erik Sherman. My thanks to you. My thanks to everybody here on the crew. Stay well, everybody. Enjoy those baseball games. And hey, by the way, in case you didn't see it, there's that Tommy Bahama shirt, baby, that's got that B on it. It's there for a reason, okay? I may have grown up in New York, but I still gotta show the colors every now and then. I'm Ed Berliner. Until next time, rock on, true believers. See ya.
You're still here?
Are you not entertained?
It's over.
All right, hey. All right, good job, guys. Let's just not come in tomorrow. Let's just take a day.
Go home.
I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Go.
That's all, folks.